The eviction notice showed up on a Thursday, taped to my door in a plastic sleeve, the kind of official document that makes your stomach drop before you've even read the first line. I remember standing in the hallway of my building for a full minute just staring at it, keys still in my hand, groceries in a bag looped over my wrist, my brain refusing to process what my eyes were clearly seeing. I'd lost my job 6 weeks earlier, a marketing coordinator position eliminated in a round of layoffs that took out a third of the department in a single Tuesday morning meeting that still replayed in my head some nights, the HR representative's carefully neutral face, the cardboard box I hadn't even needed because I barely kept personal items at my desk. Since then, I'd been careful, more careful than I'd ever been with money in my life. Rent paid on time down to the day. Groceries reduced to the essentials, generic brands, meals stretched across days I would have once eaten out for. Every unnecessary subscription canceled, streaming services, a gym membership I'd barely used anyway. I'd applied to 4 or 5 jobs a day, tracked in a spreadsheet with columns for dates submitted and follow-up needed, because if there was one thing I understood about myself, it was that structure kept the panic at bay. So when I finally unlocked my door, sat down at my kitchen table, and read the words, "Notice to vacate," printed in bold at the top of that page, my first thought wasn't fear. It was confusion. There had to be some mistake, some clerical error, some mixed-up unit number. I called my landlord immediately, my hands not quite steady as I scrolled to his contact. Mr. Petrov, a soft-spoken man in his 60s who owned 4 units in the building and had never given me a hard time about anything in the 3 years I'd rented from him. Not the time my radiator leaked and I'd called him at 11 at night. Not the month I'd paid 2 days late because of a banking error, nothing. He'd always been patient, almost fatherly in a way that felt different from my actual father, less conditional. His voice on the phone that afternoon was strange though, clipped, apologetic in a way that didn't match the situation at all, like he was reading from a script he didn't want to be reading. "I'm sorry," he said, before I'd even finished explaining why I was calling. "I have to move forward with this. It's already been decided." Decided by who? My voice came out sharper than I intended, panic starting to leak through the confusion now. "I've paid every month. I'm not behind on anything. You know that." There was a long pause on the line, long enough that I actually pulled the phone away from my ear to check if the call had dropped. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped even lower, almost like he didn't want to be overheard saying it. "You should talk to your parents," he said. And then, before I could ask him what that possibly meant, before I could even form the question, he said he was sorry again and hung up. I sat there holding my phone at the kitchen table, staring at the darkened screen, replaying that sentence over and over, trying to make it mean something other than what it obviously meant, trying on 3 or 4 alternate explanations before admitting none of them fit. My parents and I had a complicated relationship, the kind built on decades of them believing they knew better than me about every decision I'd ever made. My choice of major in college, which my father had called impractical more times than I could count. The man I'd almost married in my 20s, whom my mother disliked for reasons she'd never fully articulated beyond a vague sense that he wasn't serious enough. The job I'd taken after graduation instead of the position my father had arranged for me, unasked, at his friend's accounting firm, an offer I'd declined so firmly it had caused a rift that took almost a year to fully heal. But even accounting for all of that history, all those years of them stepping over lines I'd drawn and redrawn, I couldn't make sense of why my landlord would tell me, in a hushed and guilty voice, to talk to my parents about my own eviction. My hands were shaking slightly as I opened my contacts and called my mother. She picked up on the second ring, her voice bright and casual in a way that felt, in retrospect, entirely rehearsed, like she'd been waiting for this call and had practiced how to sound. "Hi, sweetie, how are you holding up? Any luck with the job search this week?" "My landlord just told me to talk to you about my eviction notice," I said, skipping past any pretense of small talk, my voice tight and strange in my own ears. What is he talking about? The silence on her end told me almost everything before she said a single word, a silence that stretched half a second too long to be innocent. Then I heard my father's voice in the background, muffled but audible, asking who she was talking to, and I heard her try to cover the phone with her hand, imperfectly, her words traveling through anyway, tinny and half-swallowed. "It's her. She got the letter. Something in my chest dropped, a physical sensation, like the floor of an elevator giving way beneath me. Mom, I said, very quietly now, all the earlier sharpness drained out of my voice and replaced with something closer to dread. What did you do? We were trying to help you, she said, and I could hear her voice shifting into the tone she used when she'd already decided she was right and was simply waiting for me to catch up, a tone I recognized from 100 childhood arguments. You've been unemployed for 6 weeks, honey. You're not looking for work the way you should be, you're just sitting in that apartment feeling sorry for yourself, and your father and I talked about it, and we thought if you had to move back home, if the pressure was really on, you'd finally start taking this seriously. I felt something go very cold and very still inside me, a kind of clarity that arrives sometimes in the middle of shock, when the enormity of a betrayal is too large to process all at once, so your mind narrows down instead to just the bare facts, stripped of emotion, because emotion would be too much to hold right now. You paid him, I said slowly, testing the words as I said them, watching to see if she'd deny it. You paid my landlord to evict me. We paid him to end your lease early, she said, as though the distinction actually mattered, as though reframing it in gentler language made it something other than exactly what it was. $1,000, that's all, just to speed things along a little. We thought it would motivate you to get moving. I sat down hard on my kitchen floor, my back against the cabinet, phone still pressed to my ear, listening to my mother explain, in the calm and maddeningly reasonable tone she reserved for moments when she believed with absolute certainty that she was in the right, how she and my father had gone behind my back to manufacture a crisis in my life because they had decided, unilaterally and without a single word to me, that I needed one. 31 years old, and my parents had just paid a stranger $1,000 to make me homeless because they didn't like the shape of how I was grieving my job loss. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. Not yet, though I could feel it building somewhere behind my sternum, waiting. I just told her, in a voice that sounded strange and far away even to myself, that I needed to go, and I hung up before she could say anything else, before she could offer another justification dressed up as concern, and I sat there on my kitchen floor for a long time with the eviction notice still crumpled in my other hand, feeling the entire shape of my life quietly rearranging itself around a betrayal I hadn't seen coming from the two people who were supposed to be the safest in the world. Then I picked up my phone again, and I made one call. Not to a friend, not to another family member who might talk me down or offer sympathy I didn't have the patience for in that moment. I called Priya Kapoor, a woman I'd worked with for 2 years at my old job before the layoffs, back when she'd still been my direct supervisor and had, on more than one occasion during performance reviews, told me I was wasted in a coordinator role and should be running my own accounts. She'd left the company 8 months before the layoffs to start her own boutique consulting firm, poaching 2 clients on her way out the door in a move that had scandalized the office for a solid week. We'd stayed loosely in touch since then, the kind of relationship built on occasional coffee and a standing, half-serious offer she'd made twice already, that if I ever wanted out of corporate marketing, there was a seat waiting for her. She picked up on the 3rd ring, background noise suggesting she was somewhere outside, maybe walking. Hey, stranger. Everything okay? I need to ask you something, I said, and I was surprised at how steady my voice had become in the 20 minutes since I'd hung up on my mother, like the shock had burned off and left something harder and more focused underneath it. Is that offer still open? The one you made in January? There was a brief pause, and then I heard the shift in her voice, the sound of someone straightening up, paying real attention. It is. What happened? I told her the short version. The layoff, the 6 weeks of quiet unraveling, the eviction notice, my parents. I didn't dress it up or soften it, because I didn't have the energy left to manage anyone else's reaction to it, and something about Priya's directness had always made me feel like I didn't need to. When I got to the part about the $1,000, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that landed harder than any sympathy would have. That's not help, she said. That's control dressed up as help. You know that, right? I'm starting to, I said.
Come in Monday, she said.
We'll talk numbers. We'll talk role. We'll figure out the details. But I've been wanting you on my team for 8 months, and honestly, this sounds like exactly the kind of push you didn't ask for but might actually need, just not the way your parents meant it. I hung up feeling something I hadn't felt in 6 weeks, a thin thread of something that wasn't quite hope yet but was at least adjacent to it, the sense that the ground beneath me, while still unstable, wasn't entirely gone. It didn't solve the eviction. It didn't undo what my parents had done. But it gave me something to stand on while I figured out the rest, and that turned out to matter more than I expected in the days that followed. I didn't call my parents back that night or the next. I spent the weekend instead doing something I probably should have done 6 weeks earlier, actually confronting the practical reality of my situation instead of quietly white-knuckling through it alone. I called a tenants' rights hotline I found through a 20-minute internet search, sitting cross-legged on my living room floor with a notepad, and learned that what my parents had done, paying a landlord to terminate a lease early outside the proper legal process, existed in a murky gray area that Mr. Petrov had clearly not thought through carefully. Panicked by an unexpected envelope of cash from two people he'd probably known for years through some tangential connection to my family. The eviction notice itself had procedural problems, insufficient notice period, no cause listed that would hold up if I chose to fight it. The woman on the hotline told me plainly that if I wanted to stay, I likely could, at least for another 60 days, possibly longer if I pushed back formally. I thought about it for a full day before deciding I didn't want to. That decision surprised me when I finally landed on it. Some part of me had expected to fight, to dig in out of sheer spite, to force my parents to watch their $1,000 accomplish nothing. But sitting with it longer, I realized that staying in that apartment, propped up by a legal technicality, wouldn't actually be a victory. It would just be more of the same paralysis I'd been sitting in for 6 weeks, the same static life I'd been quietly grieving inside of, except now soaked in resentment toward Mr. Petrov and my parents both. What I actually wanted, I realized, was to leave on my own terms, not theirs, and not out of stubbornness either. I called Mr. Petrov on Sunday afternoon, and this time his voice sounded almost relieved to hear from me, like he'd been dreading a fight he clearly didn't want to have. "I'm not going to make this difficult for you," I told him. "I know what they did wasn't fair to either of us. But I need 30 days, not the 10 you gave me, and I need you to give my parents their money back, because I don't want anything about this move connected to what they did." He agreed immediately, apologizing again, explaining haltingly that my mother had shown up at his door with cash and an envelope and a story about wanting to help motivate me, that he'd felt caught between not wanting to make an enemy of a longtime tenant's family and needing to seem accommodating to people he barely knew, and that in hindsight he understood he'd made a mistake. I believed him. I didn't fully forgive him. Not that week anyway, but I believed he hadn't been the architect of it, just a weak link my parents had found and pressed on. I started at Priya's firm 2 weeks later, a role with a title that sounded almost aspirational compared to where I'd been, senior client strategist, a salary 12% higher than my old job, and an actual sense, within the first few days, that my ideas were being listened to rather than filtered through 3 layers of management before quietly disappearing. The work was harder in some ways, the hours less predictable, but there was an energy to it that reminded me why I'd gotten into marketing in the first place, before years at a corporate job had slowly ground that energy down into routine. I moved at the end of the month into a smaller apartment across town, a studio I found through a co-worker's sister who was subletting, cheaper than my old place and closer to the new office. I packed my own boxes, hired my own movers, paid every cent of it myself, and there was something almost ceremonial about doing it entirely on my own terms, without a single dollar of help from anyone, especially not the 2 people who'd tried to force my hand. I did eventually talk to my parents again about 6 weeks after that first phone call, though I was the one who reached out, not them, and only because my younger brother had called me, worried, asking why I'd gone quiet on the family group chat. We met at a coffee shop, neutral ground, and I told them plainly, without raising my voice, that what they'd done wasn't help, it was control, exactly the words Priya had used, because I hadn't found better ones since. I told them that if they ever wanted a relationship with me going forward, it would have to include an actual respect for the fact that I was an adult capable of managing my own crises, however slowly or imperfectly, without them manufacturing new ones behind my back to speed the process along. My mother cried at that coffee shop, and for a moment I felt the old pull to comfort her, the reflex built over 31 years of being her daughter first and myself second. I didn't give in to it, not entirely. My father, for his part, said almost nothing, which had always been his way of processing things he didn't want to fully examine, but at the end of the conversation, he reached across the table and squeezed my hand once, briefly, and said only, "We were wrong. I'm sorry," which was more than I'd expected from him and, strangely, enough to soften something in me that I hadn't realized was still braced for a fight. We're not fully repaired, even now, months later. Trust doesn't rebuild itself on a single coffee shop apology, and there's a part of me that still flinches slightly when my mother offers unsolicited advice about anything, waiting to see where the boundary sits this time. But I have my own apartment, one I chose and pay for entirely myself. I have a job I actually like in an office where nobody arranged a favor behind my back to get me there. And I have a strange, hard-won gratitude for that Thursday afternoon and the plastic sleeve taped to my door because as much as it broke something between me and my parents, it also broke something in me that had needed breaking for a long time, the quiet, dutiful assumption that their version of help was something I owed my compliance to, rather than something I was allowed to question, refuse, and ultimately walk away from on terms that were finally entirely my own.